Well, welcome, Sam. It's so nice to have you with us this evening, and I really appreciate your spending time with the Real Bright Summit with our students and our supporters. And it's going to be a great hour. It's going to be a great time talking to you. So I'm really honored to be able to be here.
My pleasure.
So we have this question from Anna Lovell at Marquette University. And the question that she had for you about making it up is that as a college student, you managed a small apartment building in Ann Arbor, I think, in exchange for a free room. So how did you go about figuring out you could actually even do that?
Well, I actually went and visited a friend of mine one night, and he lived in a single family house. And when I got there, he told me that the owner of the house had just recently bought the house next door, and that when school was over, they were going to knock down both houses and build a 15-unit apartment building. And my instinctive reaction to that story was, we're students. We understand what students want. And, why don't we go pitch the owner and see if, we could take each, there were two of us, so each one of us taking, the smallest apartment in return for maintaining the building and leasing it and managing it. And in retrospect, that showed a level of nerve that and self-confidence that was undoubtedly unjustified. But since nobody told me that I couldn't do that, and I thought I could very logically explain, the benefits of buying into what I was suggesting. I mean, after all, you're going to end up with two people on the property 24 hours a day. They own it. They're responsible for it. They interface well with who the customer is, et cetera, et cetera. To me, that all sounded terribly logical, and it never dawned on me that these guys who had just finished or were just starting $1 million or $750,000 investment would be willing to hand it over to two college kids. But that's exactly what happened.
So one of our students, Alex Fissy from Georgia State, has a two-part question for you. How do you see the various asset classes coming out of the COVID era?
And the second question
is there any particular wariness for any sector or any asset class?
First of all, I guess I would say to you that the answer to that question depends on which asset class you want to talk about. If you were to talk about retail, I think a fair assessment of retail is a falling knife, meaning that we don't know where retail is going. We don't know how far down it's gone, but there's been an enormous diminution of value in retail real estate, and we ended up, a vastly overbuilt scenario, not so much because we put up brick and mortar, but because demand shrunk and demand went online. So I consider that to be at one extreme where we don't know the answer. And, and there have been a lot of people who've talked about, well, retail has to reinvent itself. The answer is I agree with that. How does it reinvent itself? I don't know. I mean, there are lots of different kinds of possibilities. But the real question is, does the retail store, have a long-term future? You can then move over to office space. And, office space is currently the subject that, everybody's talking about, and all because of the question of work from home. I would tell you that I think that most of the discussion about work from home and remote locations is going to turn out to be irrelevant. We are social animals. We interface with each other. We create progressive results from 1 + 1 = 3, etc. And I don't see that changing going forward. And so I think that as soon as the quote unquote CBDs are back and alive, I think you're going to see the office, and vaccines are pervasive. I think you're going to see the office space market go back to where it was before. On the other hand, you got to recognize that the office market generally is overbuilt. In the same manner, we've seen the same thing happen on the multifamily side. The difference, though, is that you really didn't do so much to, quote, add supply as the COVID thing has moved people out of downtown and into remote areas. Anybody who thinks that that's a permanent move, I got a bridge to sell them.
Agreed.
So yes, I think that there's been a definite decrease in rents, particularly in the major CBDs. But frankly, there's no reason for anybody to be in the CBDs if they're all closed down.
Right.
So I think as they reopen, so too will occupancy and rental rates, move accordingly. You could then go to hospitality, and there's a scenario where, the devastation in the hotel business has been pretty awful. And I think a lot of, second and third tier hotels may not, end up being home hotels anymore, but from a temporary conversion to a homeless situation, maybe you end up with, permanent, hotel-like facilities absorbed by that kind of social usage. It's the same manner as work from home. There's been all this discussion about, people, not traveling anymore, not, doing the things that they're going to conventions, etc. And my answer to that is, I don't believe it. You can do a sales call on a Zoom, and it works great until some competitor says, gee, I think if I went and sat across from the guy, I might be able to do better. And then he does, and he gets the deal, and that's the end of Zooming anything. And I think that's what you're going to see. And then I think that, there's also been a huge buildup of tourism demand. Where people have been locked up for, almost, I guess, a year now. And I think that, so there's recovery on the horizon, but, relatively slowly. Maybe the last, what I would call asset class in the real estate space, and actually two more. One would be single family rental, which has been turned into a pretty big business, or it was always a very big business, but it's been organized to some extent. I would only remind people that the single family business as a whole has historically been very subject to periods of oversupply. You now have builders building single family homes for the sole purpose of adding to the rental pool. I'd be waving a flag about oversupply, and I probably would say the same thing about distribution and industrial. it's the simplest form of real estate.
Mhm.
You're building a box.
Yep.
With big tenants. So, and obviously we've seen an enormous movement, probably moving up by 6 or 7 years in the amount of online retail.
Mhm.
And that's created an immediate demand for an enormous amount of distribution and industrial space. All I can tell you is, they're getting it. And so I'd be cautious about the supply demand situations. So that's kind of a run through of the real estate business.
Thank you. So let's give some advice to the students before we get out of here, because no one wants to get away from having a chance to have Sam Zell help them figure out what not to do for their career, or what the opportunities are they might want to think about. So when you're looking at new hires, what traits are important to you?
The answer really is, I want somebody who's smart, but not too smart. I'm much more interested in their level of curiosity, their level of motivation, their level of being able to work with a group of people toward group objectives. I want them to be pragmatic. I want them to, understand risk. All of which are elements that come together and hopefully allow you to both hire and, more important, train people going forward.
So how can young people possibly identify mentors for their careers and for their lives?
I think it all comes down to accessibility. I've run this place for 50 years. Uh, uh, 3 or 4 years ago, I discovered that there was a door on my office. And it had been there for 30 years, but since I never closed the door to my office, I just didn't know it was, didn't pay any attention. And so that means that I'm accessible, available, and visible to everybody. So I think it's very critical to create an open and motivated society internally that ultimately creates the mentorship without having to quote unquote identify that this is mentoring. It isn't. This is mentoring. It's the day-to-day accessibility to people who have more experience than you do, and from whom you can, learn from.
So for young people, the key piece of advice we want to leave them with is pick your companies well.
Well, start by looking and listening, and and the top dollar isn't necessarily the answer. Look to the future and say, how will working in this environment evolve into developing me into being more and more valuable going forward.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for sharing your insights with our students and with our supporters. The Real Bright Summit has totally been just overwhelmed by having you as part of it. So thank you so much.
Truly my pleasure. Thank you. Good luck.